On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, the U.S. Trade Representative has announced revised port fees for the United States. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. So, April 17th, 2025, 1 year to the date after the U.S. Trade Representative initiated the Section 301 hearing on Chinese maritime dominance in shipbuilding and all types of maritime infrastructure, has released their recommended port fees that should be charged. Now, we initially had a draft of that come out. We had 2 days of public hearings on that, and based on the information in this port report, which I have right here, all 42 pages of it, which I went through last night, dynamite reading, I might add, we now have the idea of how these port fees are going to be implemented. Is this the final port fees we can expect to see? I don't think so, because there are some issues I have with this. And before we jump into this, I just want to take a moment and a quick shout out to Ambassador Jameson Greer, who's the U.S. Trade Representative. I beseech you, Ambassador Greer, please, get somebody on your staff who understands maritime. I have no question you have some very highly trained people and representatives on your staff. However, I don't think there's anybody on your staff who knows ships. I just don't know ships, because they use phrases and terms in here that are designed to confuse the ship out of everybody. For example, what am I talking about here? Tonnage. Oh my God. In shipping, tonnage is one of the worst things you can ever use as a phrase. It's historically one of the worst measurements ever used. I have friends who've written books on this, and trying to figure out tonnage on ships is one of the most difficult things, because what ton are you talking about? And I'm not talking about a short ton, a long ton, a metric ton. That's a whole issue, different issue. How you measure tons on ships is notoriously bad. They use the phrase net tonnage in this report. Net tonnage refers to the measurement of the total interior volume of the ship's cargo spaces. In other words, how much volume of cargo you can carry. Not weight, volume, because gross tonnage is the internal volume of a ship. So when you start talking about net tonnage, you're talking about volume. I don't think they're talking about volume here. I think they're talking about net tonnage being the weight of the cargo. That's actually deadweight tonnage. And again, you get lightweight displacement. You have displacement tonnage. There are tons of ways you measure tonnage in this way. And net tonnage is one of the most confusing terms they could have used without really having a definition of what net tonnage is. They define other terms in here. They're very clear in defining ships and vessels and Chinese-owned and Chinese corporations, but they really need to define net tonnage, because as you'll see, it leads some people off the rails here into some ideas that this is going to be worse than what I think it's going to be. All right, before we go any further, hey, if you're new to the channel, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. So this is the 42-page report. I'll have it so you can download and look at it. The key is really the annexes. The annexes are the sections in which they break this all down. I am not going to take you through page by page of the report, because that's mind-numbing. Instead, I'm going to use my good buddy Mike Scholar's story over at G-Captain today to kind of break this down for you. All right, let's go into details. So phase 1 begins with a 180-day grace period where no fees are going to be charged. Afterwards, the trade rep will implement fees on Chinese vessel owners and Chinese vessel operators based on the net tonnage, this is where that comes in, of vessel capacity per U.S. voyage. The fee basis will be $50 per net ton, increasing annually over 3 years in $30 increments each year until you reach $140 per net ton in 2028. Now, a couple of key things here. The fee will be assessed on the first point of entry into the U.S. What do we mean by a voyage? So if a ship's coming from Shanghai, it's going through the Panama Canal, and then it hits a string of 4 U.S. ports, whatever first port it hits, that's going to be the one where the tariff will be settled. And remember, the tariff is being leveled on either one of two bases, either on the tonnage or on containers. It also says that it will be capped at a max of 5 assessed fees per year. So if that ship does 6 voyages to the United States per year, it's only the first 5 that will be capped. Now, I'm not sure why they're doing 5 capped voyages versus any other number. There was not a really clear explanation for that. Next, the fees will also be applicable on a non-discretionary basis, meaning fees will also apply to operators using Chinese-built vessels, regardless of the operator's nationality, but at a lower rate. So if you're a non-Chinese operator of a Chinese-built ship, you'll be paying $18 per net ton or $120 per discharge container. The rates will increase incrementally by $5 per net ton until 2028, when they max out at $33 per net ton or $250 per container discharged. Fee accrued will be based on whichever number there is higher. So again, if you're talking about net tonnage in a container, what do we mean? Are we talking about the volume of the container? Because if you put one item in a container, you're paying for the full volume of the container. If you fully load a container, which you can do with lighter material, you can spread a cost of that tariff across a lot of things. If I'm loading staplers in there, I can fill up a container with a bunch of staplers, and that cost is going to be spread across all those staplers. If, however, I load a car or a large piece of furniture in there, that entire tariff is going to be on that one item. And that's where you start seeing the issue associated with that. It goes on here, while the USTR considered applying further penalties to operators based on fleet composition or prospective Chinese ship orders, those proposals were dropped after receiving strong opposition from U.S. exporters and logistics providers. The first phase also includes a phase service fee targeting foreign-built vehicle carriers. That's assessed based on a vessel's car equivalent unit. That's basically a measurement of cars about 4 meters by 1.5 meters in length. And after the 180-day grace period, that fee will be set at $150 per CEU. So the phase one implementation here has it so that if you are a Chinese company or if you're a company using Chinese-built ships, you'll be assessed these tariffs. And to give you an idea of how those fees would be assessed, this is from Alpha Liner. They did a snapshot of ships coming into the top 20 U.S. ports in February. And if you look, you can see how many ships are Chinese-built ships versus non-Chinese built ships. And certain companies are more exposed. Zim, for example, actually had more Chinese-built ships coming in the U.S. ports than they did non-Chinese ships. Other companies with large percentages, Costco obviously is there, and then MSC, Maersk, and CMA CGM. Some companies have very little exposure. Evergreen, which is Taiwan, Yangmin, also Taiwan, HMM, Korean, have very few Chinese-built ships. And let's remember, a lot of these shipping companies are in vessel sharing agreements, not cartels. Don't call them cartels. They don't want you to call them cartels. They're in vessel sharing agreements so that conceivably you can move cargo off those Chinese-built ships onto non-Chinese-built vessels of either your own company or to a neighboring company. If you're Costco, a Chinese-owned company, you're in a vessel sharing agreement, what's called the Ocean Alliance, with two other companies, CMA CGM, a French line, and of all things, Evergreen, a Taiwanese-owned line. Chinese-owned Costco could put cargo off its Chinese-built vessels and move it onto Taiwan-owned vessels of Evergreen to avoid having to pay these tariffs. It's again, one of those weird issues. And we're also talking about future-built vessels. If you look at the container fleet, for example, also from Alpha Liner here, you can see that China has built about 1/3 of the ocean-going fleet, and they are on track to build even more vessels coming in the next few years. All right, let's continue on here. So we have some exemptions and caps here that are discussed in the article by Mike. So the USTR had established some key exemptions. So U.S.-owned vessels enrolled in the U.S. Maritime Administration programs, that's the Maritime Security Program, the Tanker Security Program, smaller vessels, so for example, ships under 4,000 20-foot equivalents, TEUs, are out. Ships in ballast, so for example, if you're bringing in a empty bulker that's going to load grain or a tanker, those ships do not incur a fee at all. So U.S. exports will not be subjected to this. Short sea shipping trade, so under 2,000 miles, will be in here. There may be some talk of trying to bring ships in, offload them, and move them to other ships to bring into the U.S. However, the U.S. executive order has provisions in there to track cargo along its entire voyage, not just what ship it's on, and then some specialized export vessels. Notably, the final action excludes previously proposed measures such as the 1 million to 1.5 million flat per port entry fee for operators with high shares of Chinese-built vessels and fees based on future orders of Chinese-built ships. Now, there is a problem here, and this is the issue I talked about earlier, where if you're using net tonnage as your measurement, we don't have to worry about the $1 to $1.5 million flat fee. However, you may have to worry about a much larger fee for a vessel. Lars Jensen, the CEO of Vespucci Maritime, one of the gurus of container shipping, has been posting this out on LinkedIn. I want to show you a post he just did. This post talks specifically about that issue where he says if you're a Costco vessel, a Chinese overseas shipping company, not Costco, the big box store that has a T in it, Costco vessel of about 13,000 TEUs, 20-foot equivalents units, that's around 60,000 net tons. Again, what the frick is a net ton? How are we measuring it, USTR? Under the limit here, what you see is under the old limit, you were maxed at $1 million. Now, however, if you're Costco OOCL, you're bringing a ship, that fee may be at 60,000 net tons, $8.4 million, or in some cases, looking at other container ships, up to about $10 million. Up to $10 million. And if you're a non-Chinese company with a Chinese built vessel, you can face up to $4 million. Now, again, I think this is a little bit of the sky is falling hysteria that we've seen happen before the first round of the USTR proposals. USTR had open hearings, they modified it and changed it, but again, I go back to this issue that Ambassador Greer, please hire somebody who understands shipping, because I think this is just them not understanding net tonnage. I don't envision that they want to get $10 million per voyage of a Chinese-owned, Chinese-built ship. They may do, in which case I'm wrong then, and I apologize. But I just think they don't quite understand what numbers they're using here in terms of taxing, because again, tonnage is one of these very confusing terms. All right, then we talk about phase two, and phase two is the implementation here of some other issues. One of the big things we see in phase two is a focus on the LNG sector. This requires that a portion of U.S. LNG exports to be U.S. built by starting in April 17th, 2028. Initially, there was a big target on U.S. exports here. However, they're focusing it just on LNG. The requirement will phase in over 22 years to give industry time to adjust, as the U.S. currently lacks the LNG shipbuilding capacity and expertise. This is the schedule for U.S. LNG exports. It is not until 2029, April 16th of 2029, that 1% of LNG exports has to be on U.S. flagged and U.S. operated vessels. And then for every subsequent year, the percentages increase so that by 2032, it's up at 2%. By 2023, it's at 3%, 2035, 4%, 2037, 6%, and 2039 up to 7%. This gives the United States the time to start up LNG ship production in the United States. They specifically talking about U.S.-built LNG. You can bring in foreign-built ships to haul LNG internationally, and one of the things we've seen recently is the reflagging in of an LNG carrier under a provision of the 1996 Coast Guard Authorization Act that allows the transportation of LNG from the United States to Puerto Rico, for example. I envision that one of the things that this is hoping for is that Korean investment in U.S. shipyards, Hanwha into Philly, we get Hyundai into HII, we may see liquefied natural gas carrier production begin once again in the United States. I also want to clarify the exemptions under the U.S. For U.S. ships. I talked about them, but specifically the small vessels, it was 4,000 TEU vessels, but 55,000 deadweight tons, or an individual bulk capacity of 80,000 deadweight tons. So one of the big provisions that came in during the hearing was a lot of shippers, especially coming from the Caribbean, we're talking about that, listen, we're making very short voyages, we're using smaller built vessels, this is going to hurt us. So they got the exemption there under for those vessels coming largely from Caribbean, South America area. All right, let's take a look at the last element here. The last section here has a notable feature in it. It has a fee remission pathway, offering operators a temporary suspension of service fees for up to 3 years if they commit to purchasing U.S.-built vessels of equivalent or greater size. This incentive structure aims to stimulate investment in domestic shipbuilding capacity, although there are concerns about limitations in the U.S. shipyard capabilities. That is a goal, trying to get shipbuilding up and running in the United States. Again, we're seeing investment by Koreans into U.S. shipyards. We may see Japanese investment. We already have Australian in Austell. We have Italian in Fincantieri up in Wisconsin. And so now we're seeing this type of investment here. Again, the goal here is to get U.S. shipbuilding and the U.S. maritime infrastructure back up and running. So they're giving this proposal. Question is, how fast can they ramp that up? And that is a big, big question. All right. Finally, there is the future Section 301 investigations that are discussed. So to counter Chinese dominance in maritime infrastructure, the trade representative has further proposed tariffs of up to 100% on ship-to-shore cranes manufactured in China or by companies owned, controlled, or substantially influenced by Chinese nationals. That follows findings that China has, quote, overwhelmingly controls global production, end quote, of ship-to-shore cranes. This deals with largely ZPMC cranes that are everywhere in the United States. Somewhere between 70 to 80% of most of the ship-to-shore container cranes in the United States are Chinese built. There were concerns, a fact that the Chinese cranes had been fitted with modems, uplinks that nobody knew about and relaying data about them. There's always the fear that China can hack into the cranes and do things. That's a fairly low order issue. More importantly, it's accumulating data and information that was not known. The other issue that they talked about here is material handling equipment, MHE. Material handling equipment for container operations is not defined here. However, I do think that one of the next rounds we're going to see here, because it was in the executive order fact sheet, is an issue about Chinese built containers and chassis. So China builds and leases almost all of the world's containers now. Back in 2008, when we had the global recession take place with the collapse of the real estate market, the shipping companies faced a big problem. They had to divest themselves of assets to keep themselves literally afloat. And one of the things they sold was containers. It's one of the reasons you don't see containers with these shipping companies' names on them as prevalent as you once did. Because today, containers are manufactured in China and they're leased by companies out of China. Same thing with chassis. One of the things that's trying to be done is to bring that manufacturing back in the U.S. The problem is Chinese manufacturing is very cheap when it comes to containers and chassis. So there's going to be something that needs to be done. We may see a tariff imposed on Chinese chassis and containers in the future, along with something on Chinese cranes. All right, so what does this all mean? Well, if you watch some news sites, and I watch them, a lot of them, you would, again, have the sky is falling. One of the biggest charts I've seen this week is this one. I keep hearing this statistic. Overall U.S. imports has dropped 64%. Holy 64%? U.S. imports have dropped 64%? Holy, that's massive. It's unbelievable, but is it true? And when you look at the data, it's not quite there. Read the fine print. This is comparing the last week of March 24 to 31, to April 1st to April 8th. It's a week. It's a week in bookings has dropped 64%. I have talked about repeatedly that if you look at the first quarter, January, February, March, cargo is through the roof. It is up. It's up 500,000 TEUs than what it normally is. Is there a drop in the first week of April? Yeah, because Trump announced all these things and everybody knew it. So guess what? They're not going to have orders here. The question isn't the first week in April. It's what's the long-term impact. When you look at the freight rates for right now, they actually appear to have a little bit of a tick up here, and then they begin to start dropping again. They're kind of holding steady right now. And these are the 4 major routes out of Shanghai, Rotterdam, LA, Genoa to New York. And the question is, do we see an uptick in those routes? So the key question is, how many sailings have been canceled? This is Drury's report for weeks 17 to 21, showing the percentage of canceled sailings. All told, out of all sailings, only 10% of voyages have been canceled so far. I did a whole video on this talking about our ships turning around. They're not turning around. But more importantly, too, we're not seeing as many cancellations as many people predicted. When you get here into the analysis between week 17 and 21, out of 713 scheduled sailings, 72 have been canceled. That represents a 10% cancellation rate. Now, over the next 5 weeks, what Drew is predicting that the most likely route that you'll see blank sailings on, basically a 56% chance if there is a blank sailing, it will be on the Trans-Pacific eastbound route. That is from East Asia to the west coast of the United States, or going through the Panama Canal toward the east and Gulf Coast ports. The Asia to North Europe will be about 31%, and then the transatlantic westbound will be about 14%. This story over at G-Captain has a statement from the World Shipping Council. Mike Schuller put this out. The World Shipping Council, who is the liner association for almost all the major container ship carriers, has raised significant concerns about the port fees. They were very vocal, very loud about the initial ones. They have a statement out here by Joe Kramick, their president and CEO. He says this, quote, "Revitalizing America's maritime sector is an important and widely shared goal, one that requires a long-term legislative and industrial strategy. Unfortunately, the fee regime announced by the U.S. trade rep is a step in the wrong direction, as it will raise prices for consumers, weaken U.S. trade, and do little to revitalize the U.S. maritime industry." Now, the maritime industry's significance to the U.S. economy is substantial. Liner shipping, container ships, move 65% of U.S. seaborne trade. That contributes more than $2 trillion annually, along with supporting 6.4 million American jobs. Ambassador Greer, the trade rep, defended the measures. Quote, "Ships and shipping are vital to American economic security and the free flow of commerce. The administration's actions will begin to reverse Chinese dominance, address threats to the U.S. supply chain, and send a demand signal for U.S.-built ships." I can't help but note that the World Shipping Council was not quite as vocal during the height of the supply chain crisis, when U.S. exporters were screaming to get U.S. exports out of the country. However, shipping firms were prioritizing the return of empty containers to Asia to load with stuff and bring back, while exports sat on the dock. Understand, that was the genesis for the U.S. Shipping Act of 1916 during World War I. It led to the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, what's become known as the Jones Act, which was a national maritime strategy. In many ways, what you see the U.S. Trade Representative doing here, what you see the Ships Act doing, and we're hoping to see a actually reintroduction of the Ships Act at the end of April this month, and what you see with the executive order by the president, is an effort to restore and basically reverse the downward trend in the U.S. maritime sector. No one is trying to unseat the Chinese. That's not going to happen, because the Chinese have ways to underbid everybody. Ask China, ask Korea and Japan that. They know that. Ask Europe that. They've all suffered at the hands of the Chinese. However, what the U.S. is trying to do is reverse that trend and bring back some maritime components to it. Rebuild part of the maritime shipbuilding sector, the cargo handling sector, and the U.S. merchant marine. There's no reason that the U.S. should not be able to handle a portion of its trade in vessels of itself. Understand, I love free trade. I am a free trade guy at heart. I love the idea of doing free trade, but it has to be fair trade. And what China has done is dominated the maritime sector, not just in one area, but in all areas. They are vertically integrating everything. And we haven't seen anything like this since the British in the 1800s. And by the way, we went to war with Britain 2 times over this in the American Revolution and the War of 1812. We saw how vital shipping was in 2 world wars. It was the key thing that was the influence maker and decision maker in both those wars. I'll argue that till I'm blue in the face. And what we're seeing right now in the resumption of peer-to-peer confrontation again and great power confrontation is shipping is becoming vital again. Trade is really essential. What makes things so much different now is how integrated the world economy is versus where it was during the world wars. But I think you don't want to just be reliant on one nation for literally almost all of the world's shipping needs. I think you really want to have some reservoir and backup, especially when you have a U.S. Navy that relies on global supply chains. It relies on shipyards and ship repairs, and a lot of the things that affect the U.S. commercial merchant marine also affects the U.S. naval side. And the Navy is just waking up to this. They're dusting off their copy of Alfred Thayer Mahan. They're reading Nick Kennedy's new book, and they understand, like, hey, commercial shipping is actually important to the Navy. No kidding. To quote one of my favorite movies, welcome to the party, pal. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell to be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? You hit the super thanks button down below, or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly, yearly subscriber. Until our next episode, Sal, signing off.